The same, and then back to camp with a feeling that we had done our best. Same rush and hurry to get ready for supper. If we had time, we would jerk off our rubbers and put on a pair of old stags, and be sure to get your own. We had little poles hanging on wire above the stove, and each man had a piece of his own to hang his wet socks and mittens. If you made a mistake once, it was all right, but the next time you found your stuff gently laid on top of the stove, and the jack with flashing eye would look at you and say, "Pard, I can learn you something if this happens again. And if you say so, can do it right now." Sometime the challenge was accepted, and it was clear the kitchen. That was at least what we said. After dinner, each man would sit on his own bunk. There was what we called the deacon seat, a short bench for strangers. Often we had a hole through one end and a little peg with a pin into it. And when the stranger sat over the hole, someone was always watching to jerk the string from the other end, and the stranger would shoot up into the air. We lit our pipes, loaded with Peerless, and smoked until the camp was blue. No games during the week, talked over the doing of the days, and if someone had made a slaw, the whole crew would roast him, and often would add a little myth to the myth of Paul Bunyan. At 9 o'clock, all lights out. Now, logging in Wisconsin starts around 1840, but it's not important then. People tended to buy their lumber from the east and have it shipped out when Wisconsin was just becoming a state. In the 1850s, there was more demand for lumber, but it still wasn't an important industry. The Civil War interrupted it, and then in the 70s it began to grow. But in the 1880s, logging really mushroomed, and the number of guys like this grew dramatically. In the census of 1880, there were 4,000 loggers listed. In the census of 1890, 23,000. So there's this five-fold increase almost in the number of people up there in the Northwoods behaving in the ways we just discussed. Many of those who joined the labor force in the 1880s had no experience in the North at all. It was very common for farm boys, teenage boys who worked on farms, to earn a little money over the winter by going north and harvesting logs. There were new immigrants coming from Europe, had no way to support themselves, went north to harvest logs. Many, or several of the lumber companies employed recruiters, we should put that in quotes, in Chicago and Milwaukee, who would scour the streets on Saturday and Sunday mornings and take the people who were dead drunk, load them on trains, and these guys would woke up horribly hungover somewhere near Rhinelander on their way to spend the winter like that. So there were a lot of people, when it went from 4,000 to 20,000. There were a lot of people who really didn't know much about logging in these camps. At the same time, there were these old guys, grizzled veterans, as Bartlett just called them, like this. I'll fresh face these young guys. And they loved to tease the new guys. Anybody have a job, a working class job? Any of you men out there ever have a working class job where the old guys teased you when you were the new guys? Pretty basic stuff, right? So somebody would complain about the cold. And one of those guys, the old guys, would say, "Cold? This isn't cold. When I worked for Paul Bunyan, the lamp on the kerosene lantern froze. We had to break it off and throw it out the window to go to sleep at night." And they'd start with these hyperbolic, exaggerated tall tales. Here's Bartlett again. In every crew, there would be, as a rule, did I just read this to you? And it was for the benefit of these tenderfoot that the wonderful tales were related. Another logger recalled there was generally one or two good storytellers in the camp, and any young fellow just starting sure got filled up on them. Some of the old-timers would put in a whole week thinking up a good one to spring on a kid on Sunday morning. Now, the veterans not only made up funny tales about Paul Bunyan, they attempted to frighten and intimidate the youngsters whenever they could. These guys, the newcomers, had no experience in the woods, and they were easily frightened by animals like the side-hill gouger. They were taken in by stories about the upland trunk that nested in trees, and especially by the hodag. Who's heard of the hodag? Okay. Now, oxen were notoriously difficult to manage and were sworn at a lot. And after an ox died in the woods, it took 7 years of burning to get all that profanity out of their hide. You can read that yourself. The hodag was an alligator-sized monster with horns, sharp claws, vicious teeth, eyes that shot fire, and a terrifying howl. One logger reported that he once, with some others in camp, hired an Indian to go out into a swamp nearby and make the most blood-curdling noises. The tenderfeet in camp were then told this was a hodag wandering in his native wilds. New men who failed to uphold their end of the work were particularly susceptible to such treatment. Sometimes they were sent through the forest at night, fearing hodags and side-hill gougers all the way, to recover a piece of equipment that turned out to be imaginary. So this is the context in which Paul Bunyan was invented. The picture on the right there is a famous hoax. Eugene Shepherd of Rhinelander, ring a bell? Yeah, some of you are nodding. Eugene Shepherd was a timber cruiser who went all over the Northwoods, measuring and selling land and ran lumbering camps on his own. And he claimed in 1896 to have captured a hodag. And he took it to the Oneida County Fair in 1896 and kept this facsimile, this surrogate, which he could move with wires and make sounds from it because he was a good ventriloquist. He charged money for people to come see it in the dark, and they couldn't quite tell what was real. So people paid money, the county fair made a lot of money, and everybody thought he had captured a live hodag. It leaked out of the Northwoods into the national press, and of course in 1896 there's all sorts of new scientific discoveries being made, and the press reported all over the country, hodag discovered, and then of course he came forward that it was, or one of his friends did, that it was really just a hoax. Then people wanted to pay to see it because it was the most famous hoax in America. So Gene Shepherd did pretty well on the hodag. He also claimed to have invented Paul Bunyan, and that's where we start. Shepherd made tremendously accurate maps. He did excellent work as a timber cruiser, and he told Paul Bunyan stories everywhere he went from the 1880s onward. One logger recalled that as the lumberjacks sat around the bunkhouse evenings listening to stories, Gene Shepherd was their conception of Paul Bunyan. I can see him now sitting in the chair, one leg crossed over the other, the upright foot tossing back and forth as he talked. I've heard him repeat stories, but they were never the same as the original telling. Always he added new particulars and amplified with greater details of astonishment the story. I think more fascinating episodes in Bunyan tales originated with Gene Shepherd than in any other mind. But he was a notorious liar. And the hodag incident shows that. A heavy drinker, and he didn't hesitate to plagiarize other people's publications. So he claimed to have invented Paul Bunyan, but we can't take it at face value. He was, however, in the right place at the right time when the first Bunyan tale was told. That was in the winter of 1885-86, and I want to read it to you. In 1938, a retired logger named Bert Taplin told the local newspaper publisher that, quote, he first heard these yarns in the winter of 85 or 86 in the Manson camp north of Tomahawk. A cruiser by the name of Bill Mulholland visited the camp on a trip from the Chippewa country. He spent 3 nights in camp and held Taplin's bunkmates spellbound with a steady flow of stories about the legendary lumberman. So here's the very first known Paul Bunyan story. Bunyan became marooned in his upper Minnesota camp by an unusually heavy snowfall. When his food supply ran low, he fashioned a pair of snowshoes and went foraging through the woods. Near camp, he found a herd of moose, shot several, and captured one alive. This moose he brought to camp and roped to drive, having fashioned a harness from bark. One of Paul's men, wishing to make a trip across an 80-mile lake, it was necessary to build a sledge and hitch up the moose. Paul let his companion sleep under the sledge blanket while he guided the moose across the lake. As the sledge struck wide fissures in the ice, water was splashed upon the blanket, which quickly froze. On reaching the far shore, which was a precipitous hill, the moose lurched the sledge from its traces and escaped. Being occupied with his driving, Paul was amazed to find his companion frozen beneath a coat of ice 2.5 feet thick when he turned around. After spending a day and a half chopping his companion loose, Paul carried him on his back over 40 miles away for a doctor's care. This, going back to the guy who remembered hearing that story, This and other yarns were related with an air of authenticity, their amperage increasing with the cruiser's stay. Not until it was time to turn in on the last night did his bunkmates realize how engagingly they themselves had been taken for a sleigh ride, at which time they hurled overshoes and everything else that was handy at the storyteller. So the earliest Bunyan tales were tall tales, inclined to test the gullibility of these newcomers. You can see that Shepherd definitely knew that story because he actually did that with a moose.